Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing really well and welcome to the next part of this koala tutorial where we're going to be drawing in the arm, which is quite a big section, but again we're going to be repeating some of the same colours that we've already used, especially sort of in the head, like the top of the head where the light is directly hitting like the forehead. It's kind of doing the same to the right hand side of the arm. We've also got this little white section as well, sort of around this area. And then, yeah, we've pretty much done half of the koala after we've drawn this arm. So to make a start then, I'm going to go in with the Raw Umber 10% Luminance pencil. And you want to start by just outlining and lightly shading some of these tufts that make up the arm. So going over some of your initial outlines and leaving that little white tuft at the bottom of the arm as it is. So maybe you want to start with just outlining that bottom section. So we've got the overall shape of the arm correct. And it is quite dark as it approaches the branch that it's sort of holding it onto. So I'm just going to roughly sort of map out where that darker shadow is. And then also outline the edge of the koala's back as it's kind of turning around. You want to do these very quick sort of flicky motions with your pencil. And if you notice, I'm holding my pencil quite far up just to get that looseness in my pencil strokes, which I feel like having that sketchier quality, especially at this early initial stage when you're just sort of mapping everything out and creating some of these like flicky lines, especially along the edge, that always works a little bit better. I think, you know, when you want to be really controlled and detailed, that's when you want to be really close to the tip of the pencil. But other than that, I'd keep it sort of midway or towards the top. So especially around these tufts here, we want to really visualise where those tufts are lighter and being hit by the light and where they're obviously a lot darker, where that fur kind of goes into the thickness of the fur, creating a shadow. You also want to use the pencil on its side. You can see how it's kind of worn down that tip of the pencil very, very quickly. That's the beauty of luminance pencils being so soft. They're brilliant for those first initial base layers, even just for mapping out like different areas like this. Just because it keeps the pencil strokes really soft, you can't really see any really fine, sharp lines. Everything's very soft, especially where we've shaded. So once you're happy with those main sort of shapes that you've kind of roughly mapped out, those main tufts within the arm, you want to start filling in the arm, so actually shading in that fur where it looks quite brown and warm tinted. And you want to shade around those darker shadows, because we don't really need to shade into those areas because they're so dark. We can pretty much go in with a dark colour straight away. So you're just simply focusing on that kind of brown tint within the fur and using this as your first initial base layer. The fur as well, it seems to be kind of all over the place. It's not really going in one specific direction. Obviously, you do want to flick out towards that edge. But everywhere else, I think having a bit of an overlap or a few different directions going on is actually going to emphasise that thick, fluffy texture of the fur and how it's very, very fuzzy. So where you've shaded should have a nice like even coverage. I've pressed on with like a light to medium pressure throughout all of those brown areas of the arm. So what I'm going to do now is go in with the silver grey luminance pencil, which is obviously what we've been using for more of the cooler tones within the fur. And especially like along the lower half of the arm, which is slightly more in the shadows. I feel like that definitely has a more cool tint to that grey colour within the fur. So I'm going to use this silver grey in some of the gaps that we've left, but also even just over the top of some of the raw umber 10%. So we've got that nice mixture between those cooler and warmer base layers. And I'm applying it in exactly the same way, keeping it quite loose and quite light to medium pressured, leaving that white tuft where kind of like the elbow is, if koalas even have elbows. Since filming the last part of this koala tutorial, I have been doing a little bit of travelling around Australia, obviously whilst I'm in Australia for a year. So hence a bit of a delay between the previous part and this part, so apologies for that. However, I've been trying to get some really good quality reference photos that we can work from, and I was so desperate to find a koala in the wild, but just couldn't find one. Apparently they're really hard to find in the wild. I've seen quite a few at like wildlife sanctuaries, but so far no luck in terms of finding a koala in the wild. I even took my binoculars. You know, I was really trying. I was looking through all the trees, like right at the top, because that's where they tend to chill out, but no, couldn't find any. But I'm determined to find one before I leave Australia, definitely. Tick that off the bucket list. They're just the cutest little animals ever. I think I'm mainly adding it towards like the forearm. The top of the arm is being hit by the light, so I think there's a lot more warmer, there's more warmer colours going on there, so I'm not going to add as much of this silver grey up in that area. I've added a little bit to that edge. But yeah, other than that, I'm going to leave it there with the silver grey. And notice that I still have left those really dark shadowy areas as they are. I've not shaded into those areas just yet. So next up, I'm going to go in with the French grey 30% for those warmer areas, going over the top of the raw umber 10% that we've just used. And over the silver grey areas, I'm going to go in with the slate grey. So basically just two slightly darker versions of what we've just used there. Still sticking with the luminance pencils. So I'm going to start with the French grey 30% and just build up some of that warmer brown colour in the grey fur. Keeping your pressure quite light and using the pencil on its side. And you can kind of tell the direction that the fur is going in some areas, but like I said, it is very fuzzy and sort of overlapping throughout the arm. So again, soft flicking outlines all along the edge of the koala's back. You want to slightly curve the line as well whilst you're flicking. Feel like it looks a little bit more natural, and also have some of the lines overlapping as well. So you can see how that's kept the brown tinted colours of the grey fur warm and just built them up a little bit more. And then you want to do the same with the slate grey, but focus more on those shadowy areas. So at this point, this is where you can start to fill in those darker shadows around the tufts. And they should start to give the fur a little bit of depth as well. So you can see that I'm not focusing on any details at all, I'm just focusing on the tufts and those light and dark areas within the fur, just building all of that up really gradually. I'm going to add a little bit to the outer edge as well, just along the back. Next up I'm going to go in with the Ivory Black Derwent drawing pencil, which is my favourite black pencil for achieving really dark areas and adding a lot of depth to fur. So just focusing on these really dark areas of shadow around the tufts, you want to use the Ivory Black just to build up that sort of dark pigment, and start off with like a light to medium pressure until you're happy with like the shape of that shadow, and then you can apply a much harder pressure to start filling in the tooth of the paper and reducing that grainy texture. So once you're happy with those tufts, you can then use a harder pressure to just build up that darkness. I think I'm also going to draw in this really dark shadow that's just above the leg, below the arm. So if you just want to lightly outline the side of the leg as well down here. Whilst I've got this ivory black in my hand, I'm going to fill in this area here, and you just want to go in straight away with a really hard pressure, as it is really, really dark. And it's kind of where the hand meets the branch, but also it's not getting any light at all. This section's sort of covered by the arm, covered by the leg, and the light can't really reach it, so it just looks pretty much pitch black. So that's the area that we want to shade in. Just going to move the camera down slightly so you can see that last little bit that I've drawn. So yeah, really press down quite hard and fill in the tooth of the paper so it looks completely smooth. And you want to sort of flick back into the edge of the leg. And same with the bottom of the arm, so kind of flick back up into those lighter tufts along the edge. So you can see that there's not really any tooth showing through. There's not really any grain. There is towards the edge where it sort of merges into that branch, but we've not started that bit yet, so that's fine. But in terms of the bit that I was just shading in, I've completely flattened that sort of tooth of the paper, so it looks completely smooth, really, really dark, which is exactly what I wanted. So you can work into these shadows a little bit more if you want to, make sure they're really dark. Even if you're wanting to just make some of these tufts a little bit darker without full on sort of squashing down the tooth of the paper, then you can do. Just use a bit of a lighter pressure. This fuzzy fur really is kind of just made up of loads of clusters of bits of shading, if you actually break it down. So next up I'm going to go in with the shade Primrose, which is like a really pale yellow. And you want to work into the areas of the fur that are being directly hit by the light and illuminated, creating a little bit of like a creamy yellowy tint within the fur. You want to use a light to medium pressure with this one and almost kind of drag some of those shadowy areas into the lighter parts of the fur as well. If you do end up shading over some of that darker pigment, that's actually fine because it'll help all those pigments to sort of blend, especially towards the edges. So I'm just sort of glancing at the reference photo and adding in that shade Primrose as and where I see that slightly like illuminated colour within the arm. I'm also going to go in with the pink white, which is kind of similar but obviously a bit more warm. I'm going to use this for those slightly warmer, like pinkier toned areas. It's not really that obvious, so just kind of follow where I'm placing this colour. It's not essential either, I just think it's a good start to help us start blending some of these colours together and just building up the fur a little bit more, especially in the lighter parts. So nothing more than that. You then want to go in with the raw umber 50%. So we use the raw umber 10% to begin with. This is a bit more saturated, and as you can tell it's got a little bit of a greeny tint to it as well, but still very, very neutral. We've used this quite a lot in other parts of the fur as well, so it should help to just kind of match everything. So you want to use this as your sort of mid-tone. So you want to kind of shade over some of those more subtle shadows and tufts within the fur, as well as kind of building up that main colour within that grey sort of browny tinted fur as well. So here I'm just flicking some little hairs into that chest area to show that the arm is in front. So you can see that this is the colour that just sort of ties everything together. And again, from that shadow you want to sort of flick into those lighter hairs within the chest. Leaving some lighter tufts in between to show that those hairs from the chest are falling over the top of this part of the arm. So I know that you can see quite a lot of the individual lines and pencil strokes, especially along this edge where the back is, but everywhere else I've tried to keep quite soft. You can't really see those individual pencil strokes or lines. It's all quite soft. So that's what you're aiming for at this stage. Next up, I'm going to go in with the Warm Earth 40% to add a bit of that warmer, like pinkier tone to areas of the fur. So again, there's not really any area in particular where I'm adding loads of this colour. You just want to kind of weave it in the whole arm. So focus on those warmest areas that maybe look a little bit more brown compared to some others. And just give it that slightly warmer tint with this Warm Earth 40%. It's still quite neutral considering it's like a pinky tone. I'm going to go in with the sepia 10%, which is more of like a lilac-y grey, which again we've used quite a lot in the face area. And you just want to use this to, again, just build up more of that sort of mid-tone within the fur. And you should find at this point it starts to reduce that grainy texture that it's picking up from the paper. You can see a lot of that sort of tooth and grain underneath our layers because we've not really added enough yet. So just to help us fill that in, you just want to work into more of like the light parts of the fur. And again, just kind of weave it in and around everything really, just like we've done with the Warm Earth 40% that we've just used. And we should have a nice mixture then between all these lovely neutral like grey tones that make up the fur. So I'm going to leave it there, I think, with the luminance pencils, and now transfer to the polychromos. These are obviously a lot harder, so it's going to really help us to push everything that we've got down so far into those grooves within the paper, so we get a lovely blended finish. And also it's going to help us to bring out more of that detail, because we don't really have any detail at the moment. It's just like a application of loads of different colours together. So I'm going to go in firstly with the dark sepia polychromo and focus on those sort of shadowy areas within the fur. And you can see already how smooth that area is. I just think the luminance pencils are the best for those first few layers, and then with the polychromos on top you just get the best result. So you want to do more controlled back and forth motions and hold the pencil more towards the tip. And it's always at this stage where your hand should start to ache because you're pressing down quite a lot harder than what we've done so far. So to create this fuzzy texture, I'm kind of doing little quick zigzag motions in a cluster and leaving a bit of a gap in between them. And sort of doing them in all sorts of different directions as well. At this point I'm going to return to some of the colours that we've already used, like the silver grey luminance pencil right at the beginning. I'm just going to bring back some of those cooler tones within the lighter parts of the fur. And you should find that it blends really, really nicely with what we've got down so far. You can use a bit of a harder pressure as well with this one. So I've used it along that bottom edge of the arm. I'm just going to use it into the lighter parts of the fur. Sort of add those clusters of shading with my pencil. Sort of weave it in and around that dark sepia. Maybe a little bit along the edge as well, along the back. I'm also going to go back in with the shade Primrose, and again just focus on pulling out some of those lighter bits of the fur where it's kind of illuminated by the light, and it'll just help to blend and also add that really pale, like yellowy tint to the fur as well, which we did add before, but sometimes you just need to go in with a few colours that you previously used and kind of bring them back up to the surface, especially when we've added quite a few layers over the top. So back to the polychromos, I'm going to go in with the dark indigo, which is a really dark blue, and just work into some of the darker shadowy areas and bring back that slightly cooler tone within the arm so we get more of a balance. So you might be shading over some of that dark sepia that we added just before, or in some new areas. I'm going to also return to the French Grey 30% Luminance pencil and just add a bit more shading into the lighter parts of the fur. Just blending out any more of that grainy texture that you can see before we go in with the really dark details. So I'm just going to add a tiny little bit of the shade Nugget, which is a polychromo, just to add a quite neutral light brown to some areas of the fur, just to keep parts of the fur looking a little bit warmer tinted than others. And again, really look at where the light is hitting the arm and what colours it's sort of bringing out or illuminating. So at this point I'm going to focus on pulling out all of those really dark details, looking at the texture of the fur and creating that really fuzzy texture. So for this you want to go in with the black polychromo, making sure it's really quite sharp. And you also want to blend the end of the arm, so like where the hand is sort of holding onto the branch. You want to blend that a little bit into the shadow. I'm going to focus on that bottom edge of the arm as well and just do some pencil strokes that are flicking up towards the rest of the fur, just so it looks really neat and sort of finished off. I can do the same with the edge of the leg as well. could even add a few sort of random lines like this, do a bit of mark making that's sort of overlapping squiggles, again to create that sort of fuzzy texture. I'm going to use the warm grey one along the back and along the edge. Sometimes the end does snap off when you're using a bit of a harder pressure. But I'm just going to continue to add some more like flicky motions with my pencil to create some wispy hairs along the edge. You want them all different lengths, slightly overlapping, but the main thing is you want to flick with your pencil to create that kind of wispiness. Like that, and you could even go in with the pink white, which is a really pale luminance pencil that we used briefly before, just to help kind of smudge and blend that edge as well. Just kind of blend and drag some of that main pigment along the back into some of those individual elongated hairs, just for a bit of extra softness. So it's a kind of very gradual fade off. I'm now going to pull out some of those highlights and add in even more details to create that fuzzy texture using the craft knife slice tool, which is always my favourite part of any drawing. So you want to work into the lighter parts of the fur this time, and yeah, kind of create like a cluster of lines or a section that's slightly brighter, or really fine little hairs, like little wiggly lines like this that are overlapping and going across the tufts to really emphasize that texture. Also use it to neaten up edges, add in any finer lines, and just completely elevate that whole realistic element. This is where it'll really start coming to life, so take your time with all these little details. It really does make such a difference. So I'm going to leave it there with the craft knife size tool, and I'm going to use briefly the cadmium yellow lemon, which obviously is super vibrant, but I'm just going to use it as like a bit of a glaze over the top of those lightest areas that are being illuminated by the light. Now you literally just want to brush it across the surface, like apply no pressure whatsoever really. The tiniest little bit to these brightest areas, like the top of the arm. I think it's always best if you add like a little bit and then just take a step away, look at it as a whole, and then judge as to whether or not you need to add a little bit more. But just that little bit of subtle lighting really makes such a difference. But yeah, just apply it to that top area here. Nowhere else really. And then just to finish off, I'm going to go back in briefly with the warm grey 1 polychromo and just add a bit of detail into this lighter little tuft at the bottom of the arm, and just kind of finish that edge. And then you can always go back in with the black as well and just kind of work around some of those lighter details that we've added in. So I think I'm going to leave it like that for the arm. So thank you for following along. I hope you've managed to sort of stay on track and end up with a really realistic koala arm that's full of colour and full of those fuzzy little details. Obviously you could keep going forever with these tiny little lines, and do take your time with it, you know, be patient and take your time building up these tiny little details, because it does make such a difference, especially with the craft knife size tool. But yeah, I think I'm going to leave it like that for part 4. So thank you so much for following along, and as usual I've left the materials list, the line drawing and the reference photo in the video description below. So you should have everything that you need to complete part 4. The next part I'm going to do, I think, is going to be the branch before we finish the legs off. I think I'm going to do the branch on the left and the little foot that we can see that's gripping onto it. And then I'll probably make a start on the leg and the lower back before we complete the koala tutorial with those green eucalyptus leaves. So yeah, thanks for following along, and I'll be back very, very soon with part 5.